I mean, of course, you just said you're God, so it can be easily absorbed without noticing, yet it's misinformation. And one could argue that we live in cages too. Ricken is more than a man. He's a writer. The books come from him. No Ricken, no books. Ricken Hale's The You Are is an absurd and self-obsessed spiritual self-help book that plays a crucial role in Severance. In this video, we're breaking down every chapter, quote, reference to understand how nonsense became gospel in the world dominated by Lumen. Spoiler alert for Season 1 and 2 of Severance, the Lexington Letter, and the book The You Are. Grab a cup of coffee, tea, chocolate, because we'll have a long talk over legumes. Let's get started. There are a couple of elements that are present in the book but absent in the show. So let's discuss these first. In chapter 2, Ricken writes, "My glorious wife, whom readers of Petard already know as Devon, had felt increasingly anxious with city life since the Dorner truck explosion the previous year." This is a direct reference to the Lexington Letter. If you have not read it, I suggest you do so. There are a couple of videos that literally read it for you, and I will link them in the description box. So this will be the only spoiler for the Lexington Letter here. And it's interesting that the explosion is not mentioned at all in the show. It's just mentioned in these two extra pieces of art that we get about Severance. In the Lexington Letter, we read your thorough coverage of the Dorner truck incident on November 3rd. And then, she didn't know anything about the Dorner truck down there, of course, but I tried to press her more about the numbers. And this is an outie talking about her Innie. I was stunned. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't stop the thoughts from coming. 2 people were burned alive in a truck. The next day, Donna said that some of their devices had been destroyed. The prototypes or whatever, it almost seems like this was some kind of corporate espionage. As you reported about the truck that had been blown up in New York at 2:32 p.m. that day. The Dorner Therapeutics truck. Dorner, of course, is a major competitor of my now former employer, Lumen. The Lexington Letter is one of the reasons why some of those who watched Severance when it first came out 3 years ago were speculating about what are they actually doing in Lumen's premises. And that's what I still think might be related to what the other employees are doing. Not Mark, who is clearly connected to the testing floor with Gemma. I'm still thinking about what the others are doing, and perhaps Lumen is hiding something else. Another element we learn more about, thanks to the You Are, is in chapter 2 again. I carried it as I walked to the podium at Nan's funeral a year and a half later. A patch of ice on a dark road had taken her life from us. In season 1 of Severance, we only learn about Gemma and her supposed accident in which she allegedly died. But I couldn't really find the point in the show in which we hear about it happening because of ice. And now I guess it's only here in the You Are. And this also confirms the very first theory that we all had in the first episode of season 1, in which Mark and Helena cross paths for the first time as he is exiting the parking lot and she points out the icy roads. There are some recurring themes and elements that we partially covered already in my analysis and that are further explored in here. So let's see them one by one. Name. In chapter 1, we read, "Let us address the elephant in the room, my name." And then he starts talking about Hale. And I thought, isn't it common to first address the meaning behind the first name of a person instead of their family name? And goes on, the name in fact comes from hallus, the Swiss word for virile or strapping. And basically in every single line in this book you will see Ricken's ego sometimes hidden, some other times overt. But proud though I am to be a Hale, it is my first name with which I more readily identify, Ricken. And I found interesting that at this point he doesn't tell us anything about the meaning behind Ricken. And then goes on, your first name is yours, to make of it what you wish, unladen by the sins and agonies of generations past. And in that, there is power, dear reader. And if you remember, in my analysis, I discussed the importance of names and the fact that Innies actively chose to keep their names despite learning about their full name, so their surname as well, and yet they still chose to be called what Lumon decided for them. To me, however, it is clear that namelessness stymied the species' development, which is why they now live in cages, whilst man drapes himself in finery. And one could argue that we live in cages too, but within the show, see the case of the Innies. Whatever your type, I want you to find another scrap of identical size and write upon it the next key piece of your identity, your first name. I will get into the types he's mentioning here later on, but for now I wanted to point this out because he is basically asking the readers to build a little shrine and to add a new totem at the end of each chapter, more or less. And this reminded me of Sissy's and Harmony's shrines. This is a little borderline, but in chapter 2 he writes, I shall refer to these two under the pseudonyms Flip and None, though this is regrettable as their real names flow far better with my natural diction. And this is how he calls Mark and Gemma in the book, and I found it funny that basically everything revolves around Ricken, no matter the topic, no matter the situation. At some point in chapter 4, Ricken mentions the name of his daughter, and I didn't realize her full name, Eleanor Rebecca Scout Hale. So I didn't realize that Rebecca was her middle name. And then in season 2, episode 2, they're discussing about Cobell, and Devon says, or Cobell or whatever the F. And then Ricken goes, perhaps Cobelvig would be a helpful nomenclature. And in season 1, episode 5, he makes clear that he intended to give his daughter Gemma's name as middle name. When he says to Mark,
of course, the baby's middle name could have been so lovely a tribute to her, but I understand you were unable to be comfortable with it.
And a line interestingly said by Rebecca at the end of season 1 while they're reading out loud excerpts from the book. She says, it was transformative. I'm gonna have to change my name again. Religion. There's an entire chapter, chapter 3, that is called Good God. I will examine how the intricacies of religion and its refraction through the cracked prism of art play into one's identity. And we discussed religion in both parts of my analysis, but here he uses an example that maybe I wouldn't have used, not specifically to talk about religion, but it's in perfect Ricken's fashion. Sister Act, condemned in its era as blasphemous, a brutalist eulogy of 20th century sectarianism, vapid pages. So basically he's pouring his hate for Sister Act on these pages. And I find it funny because I grew up in a religious household, and despite these features that he's mentioning, Sister Act was still allowed and actually beloved. To be honest, I know the songs by heart, and I even sang the solo parts on stage in theater, because Whoopi Goldberg's parts are some of the very few popular songs that I can sing, because I'm both a mezzo-soprano and a contralto. Just a little fun fact. So I wasn't personally offended by this mention, but I found it funny. And he keeps going for a couple of paragraphs and then writes, Sister Act ultimately comes down to one thing and one thing only. It's simply nowhere near as profound as it thinks it is. And of course, the irony, because Ricken's work is not as profound as it thinks it is. I think the writers of this piece and of the show in general have had a blast. I myself ascribed to no defined religion, though certain experiences endow me with a potent sense of the divine. For example, the thrill of publishing a global bestseller. And I thought, yeah, maybe, except usually when you are about to publish, you don't really know if it's gonna be a bestseller yet. Yes, we know that he has written multiple books already, so he is an established author, but still, he's so sure he's gonna succeed. He's so perfect, you know? And I mean, these are the tiny details that I find annoying about Ricken. And he always reminds you that he's the best, he's the center, or whatever. And he's pointing out his success whenever he can, which again, brilliant work done by the writers to make sure that I hate this character. By reading this book, you prove that I'm real, just as the money I received for it proves that you are. In that way, dear reader, we are each other's God and each other's worshipper. And this, more than any other, is a religion I can get behind. I mean, of course, you just said you're God, so... And here it's interesting because we almost see a godlike figure again, just as we saw with Kier. In here, he is suggesting that he could be your God. But still, go again to the vanity and affix a totem of it to the mirror. If by some chance you found commonality with my conception of faith outlined above, feel free to use a photo or etching of me to convey this. At this point I was getting nauseous listening to the audiobook or reading the text. He basically wants to be the face of God in your teeny tiny shrine.
Well, we're at the point where traditionally I would say something like, dig in.
And towards the end, there's a hilarious part in which he writes, please keep in mind that you are now in a state of enlightenment, which can be both disorienting and highly dangerous. I urge you to exercise caution whilst in this state and refrain from speaking publicly or driving a car. Oh my goodness.
Against the door or to the side?
I think either's really good.
My babe, I'm going to put it off to the side.
Awesome.
Siring. In chapter 1, Ricken writes, readers of my previous books know that both my conception and birth took place in a small theater. And I'm asking you, who the hell would ever want to know the place of their conception? And not only to know about it, also to share it in a publication. And he continues, it was noteworthy in that I was the first child sired exclusively for theatrical purposes. And I told you that I had never heard the word sired before watching Severance, and in this book we hear it 3 times, whereas in the show we heard both James and Dr. Mauer say it. And here is another example in chapter 4. We didn't know it yet, but we had just sired what will, by the time of publishing, be our firstborn daughter. And at the end of the same chapter, he gives you again permission to use his image, saying, here again I consent to my own image being used, should that happen to fit the bill, which I found disgusting. And this is because there are so many other things that I'm not sharing here from this specific chapter, which is called A Coitus Among Us. So if you're really curious, I leave it to you.
Babe, I just don't want to be like my father.
No, baby. I think it's good you're getting it out now. It's okay.
Poverty. In chapter 8, Ricken writes, "I have always admired the poor." And when I read it, I was like, admired? How dare you? Who? But this reminded me of Sissy in season 2 episode 8, who sells stuff to the poor, as if that was normal. And at some point there's another piece that shocked me that reads, "3 cheers for the needy." I was like, oh my god, what? And since in this chapter he's talking about charity, now he's explaining how you should do it. The concept I birthed that day was elegant but simple. Take snippets from positive reviews of my books and replace my name with that of a group whom I feel is more in need of a compliment. Usually this is the poor. I was speechless. Come on. But this truly reminds me of some out-of-touch people that we see nowadays online. I mean, of course, this is just a character portrayed with all possible exaggerations, and yet some of these features and words that he says can actually be found. So, and even in the show, when Ricken is discussing the book with Natalie in season 2 episode 3, Natalie reads, "But surely beer and juleps cannot fill the void left by love. Indeed, only wine can achieve this, but it is famously costly."
Which is why sadness is among the most recurrent issues facing the poor.
And her comment is remarkable, so astute.
A society with festering workers cannot flourish, just as a man with rotting toes cannot skip.
Conformity. In the introduction, there's a whole categorization of who you are supposed to be or who you can be, and we will get to that in a minute. But basically, he is clearly choosing some categories over others, and yet at the end he says, "I welcome you upon this journey with equal affection." And that immediately brought me back to Miss Casey's line about enjoying each fact equally. And in chapter 1 he goes, "Rather, they had made art my brother, a co-equal sibling." Such a weird phrasing, right? This sentence made me think of 2 different things. One is back in season 2 episode 4, when Hale reads, "I was not born into this world alone. The lodgings of my mother's womb I shared with another, a twin brother who was called Dita." And even though the kind of brother Ricken is talking about is just figurative, it still made me think, because he still says a co-equal sibling, just as a twin could be. And then the concept of equality that comes back again, which we discussed in the conformity section, but also identity fusion. And when I was looking more into this, I found another quote from season 1 episode 7, in which there's a voiceover by Mark saying,
"I loved all these things about her equally."
And in chapter 3, Ricken writes, "These are of course mere suggestions, and I lovingly support whatever faith or deity you choose to follow. All at day's end are both valid and beauteous." And here he is pairing Youtypes, we'll get into that, with religious groups. And of course his line about them being equal, because again he showed some preference.
What separates man from machine is that machines cannot think for themselves. Also, they are made of metal, whereas man is made of skin.
The you are and Innies. As you know, if you watched both seasons of Severance, Innies found the book quite helpful, even revolutionary. See for instance at the end of season 1, when Innie Mark is on the outside and tells Ricken that it opened up the world for him. And of course Ricken thinks he's just kidding, because he has no idea they have been switched. And Mark says, "Yes, this book changed my whole life." And then Ricken says, "I know sometimes I make you feel less than for having had the procedure, and I regret that." So as soon as Mark for the very first time is giving him compliments, Ricken feels a little bit guilty. And you will see in a bit how much Ricken and Mark have a difficult relationship. And this is just one of the things that he despises about Mark, because the relationship was difficult even before he chose Severance. And then in season 2, episode 2, in the aftermath of Innies seeing the outside world, Ricken says Mark's workie went to great lengths to awaken himself to alert us to abuses. He was inspired by my book. He found great meaning in it, profundity. And in the following episode, when Natalie and Ricken are discussing a possible publication made for Lumen, Natalie says Ricken's words have had a profound effect upon our workers. And Ricken tells Devon Natalie wants to discuss a version of the UUR specifically for Innies. And then they are discussing the specifics of this potential publication, because Devon doesn't really agree. And Ricken says, she said that Innies tend to thrive in an environment of structure, and once that is established, then you are more open to self-expansion. So I am just trying to speak their language. And Devon replies, I know, but this sounds like Lumen's language. And even though he seems to be doing something positive and trying to help Innies, it's not entirely clear what's his agenda, at least not in the show, whereas Devon seems more convinced that this is a really bad idea.
Mark, would you help me hang the kelp?
Mark and Ricken. Chapter 7 in the UUR is called Wounds Unhealed, and there's an interesting confrontation where both of their characters really show themselves. You can really tell who they are, how they behave, and why they don't like each other. Ricken goes, so you really think you will stick with this job? Yes, Ricken, says Mark. And the confrontation goes on for a while, and at some point Ricken writes, selfish bastard, thinking about Mark. And when Mark really wants to hurt him, says, we listened to it to make fun of you, Ricken. We'd laugh at it. She'd laugh at it. That was the joy it gave us. Everyone laughs at you the second you walk out of the effing room. And you can really tell that Mark, especially when he's angry, he can really hurt people, and he is not too careful about what he's saying. And at the dinner without food in season 1 episode 1, we hear Ricken say,
Mark's late wife Gemma was an educator as well, Russian literature.
And then goes, but Mark is a Lumen man now. Mark's work is sensitive enough to require the severance procedure. And people start discussing, and then he goes,
The point is that Mark made a decision, and that decision was controversial, ethically and socially.
Morally, scientifically. But Mark, I stand behind you without reservation. What a hypocrite. And as you heard multiple times already in this video, he says something trying to be as accommodating as possible, but then he goes on with whatever he thinks is true and right. And again, when Ricken was talking about Innie Mark in season 2 episode 2, he says, and I think that your workie was excited. I have to say, Mark, he really is a jewel.
If the thief reads the book, it will have been worth it. In fact, I bet you he turns himself in afterward.
There are some sections or quotes that we hear in the show directly taken from the UUR. Some of these were released in this excerpt, which is only 8 chapters long. Some others are supposedly in the rest of the book, which was not released, so we cannot read anything else other than what they say in the show. Most of it is voiceover in season 1 episode 5, and after reading the book I was expecting the worst from every single quote, but then I realized there is actually some good advice hidden in there. For example,
should you find yourself contorting to fit a system, dear reader, stop and ask if it's truly you that must change, or the system.
This feels like an accidentally good piece of advice, whereas in season 1 episode 4 we see Dylan read the entire chapter 5, which is a poem, so I will not repeat it here. But something I really found interesting was in episode 6, season 1, in which we have Ricken as voiceover, and he reads, "What does camaraderie mean? Most linguists agree it comes from the Latin camera, which means a device used to take a photograph. And of course, the best photographs are of groups of happy friends who love each other deeply. But I think camaraderie is more than smiling together in photos. It's standing together in hard times. It's recognizing a common struggle in another person and reaching out to offer them a loving hand." Now, despite the positive message, ultimately, there's something that really annoyed me in here. So, if you missed my previous analysis, these 2 videos up here, go watch them. But aside from that, I told you that I'm a linguist. And if someone mentions a linguist in a show, I want to know more. So if you don't know, what he's telling you is false. And it doesn't really have a negative impact on anybody. Yet it's false. If you don't know, he is giving you the meaning of the word camera, which comes from camera obscura, literally dark chamber, but this has nothing to do, except sharing the same root, with the origin of the word camaraderie, because camaraderie in English comes from French, camarade, which means roommate, and it was often used to refer to troops sharing the same accommodation. We still use the same word in Italian for the same meaning, camerata, and the word camera in Italian still means chamber, room. So you see, there is a connection and a potential misinterpretation, because in Italian, yes, the words sound the same, camera, except, for example, the word for camera, the device you use to take photographs, in Italian is macchina fotografica, literally photographic machine to take photographs. And it's so easy to confuse people with something like this, a teeny tiny detail that doesn't really match and doesn't necessarily hurt anybody. And yet, it's a tactic, because this is totally unnecessary misuse of etymology and linguistics. And this misuse fits the character, but also the show, because it's subtle. It can be easily absorbed without noticing, yet it's misinformation that people are more likely to trust because it's prefaced by the false claim most linguists agree, which is similar to studies show without referring to any actual study. If you're not citing the sources, it's quite pointless. And this is something that he does more than once, I think, in the book, to say studies show. I found this interesting because it's false, but since it's not a key plot point, we don't notice it and we don't care about it. And this is exactly how some corporations and institutions talk to the public. We are in the so-called age of information, and yet we are in the age of misinformation. It's so much easier to give false information that is maybe containing one true statement and everything else is false. And this is why we fall for it. This show really gives us ways to think about our society. See, for example, the passage he's reading from the first chapter at the end of season 1, when he says, "Don't worry, my research for this book has proven the claim untrue," but we don't see any sources for this. And in season 2, episode 5, when Devon is reading the draft for the Innies specific, the UUR, she says it's literally the opposite of what you were saying before. And that's when he says something possibly true for once. This is a fiscal and creative opportunity, unlike any I have yet seen, and I'm not inclined to just walk away from it, unless me selling millions of copies of my book and the life that manages to give us has somehow lost its appeal for you. He is so self-absorbed and shameless. And when Milchik finds the book, he randomly reads a page with the title for
Chapter 12, on learning to be emotionally nude in front of my wife.
And I'm so glad they didn't release chapter 12.
I went giddy when Mark mentioned you were looking for someone.
So serendipitous. Kelp worked, huh?
Since this video is getting long again, I will have to split the video into 2 parts. And now let's just focus on the note from the author and the introduction, so the very beginning of the book, and we will discuss more details in a second video. So please subscribe, hit the notification bell so you won't miss that upload. And now let's get into the book analysis.
Bullies are nothing but bull and lies.
A note from the author, Ricken Hale. I was deeply eager to share its splendors with you, and this immediately made me think of the goodly splendors at the very end of season 2. Unfortunately, he continues, events beyond my control have led to a brief delay as I liaise with several corporate parties. And this is quite concerning, yet he manages to make this hilarious nonetheless by writing, I've no doubt this will cause widespread dismay and wrath, but I ask that you remain non-violent. And then he goes, please know that these pages are but the first steps on the journey, and that full self-knowledge cannot be attained until you experience the book in full. And the introduction gives us a connection to the show and to the very first words we hear in the show, which are repeated multiple times throughout both seasons, because he begins with, but what indeed is you? How can you mean different things to millions of readers around a vast earth? And I found this expression quite interesting, a vast earth, because he repeats it twice in the same paragraph, I believe. So he made me notice it even more. And then continues, and perhaps most importantly, who are you? He wants us to believe that we are the center of this book, and that our relationship with the book is intimate and profound because we are its subjects. And then he writes, me, I'm the subject of Dr. Ricken's new book. Yeah, right, in my dreams maybe. And I'm like, who the hell would dream of it? Come on. And then he goes on depicting these characters, these categorizations, which are crucial to the rest of the book. And the criterion for this is the reaction that we have after reading the first pages. He says, how did you feel as your eager eyes fell to the page? Statistically, your reaction almost certainly fell into one of 5 categories, and figuring out which one is deeply instructive in determining your you. The first one is the coward. First, perhaps you simply stopped reading, fearing the sting of revelation. Then we have the warrior, impulsive and volatile. You have come to this book seeking respite from your own fire. Then we have the dove, peaceful to a fault. You prioritize amity over justice and vehemently avoid tumult. Next we have the scribe, the rarest type of person. You cannot help but weave your thoughts into splendid prose for which society rewards you with acclaim. You may have already won several prestigious awards and are likely considered charismatic and dashing by your peers. And this is basically the last thing I would think about when you say scribe, because to me a scribe is a humble person who willingly stays hidden in some archive, in a monastery, who is diligently writing or transcribing some work without expecting any fame from it. Whereas Ricken's view is based on his own desires to win awards and to be acclaimed, which is also quite unrealistic if you think of most writers in the world. And finally we have the vessel. Mayhaps you spent this whole introduction in self-conscious dread, wondering how this cultural touchstone has eluded your knowledge. You have come into this book an innocent, teeming with beauteous potential. You are the vestal, and in your absence of knowledge there is room for wisdom. And this is exactly how Innies received this once they found the courage to read it. And then he says, at this point I urge you to write down your Youtype on a scrap of paper and affix it to your vanity, as it will prove important over the course of this book. And the word vanity is repeated towards the end of each chapter, but the first time I heard it, it made me think, because I don't really know how common it is to own a vanity. I mean, I've never owned one, and I wouldn't call a vanity the place where I do the same things you would do with a vanity. But to me, the only meaning is something vain, which actually applies perfectly to Ricken as well. So perhaps there is this double meaning, or maybe I'm the only one thinking about that because I'm not used to vanities, you know?
You think you need your job. Your job needs you.
But I have to be honest, I really do not appreciate self-help books in general, and the same applies to fake ones, just like this one. But a book that tells me to pause and take notes really annoys me. I mean, if I feel like annotating something, I will do it spontaneously, somewhere else, not on the book. But this meta reading experience is something that really bothers me, especially about self-help books. And after this is when he says that line, be you, the coward, the warrior, the dove, the scribe, or the vestal, I welcome you upon this journey with equal affection, which of course is false, especially given the description that he just provided for each category. I'll leave you here with this video. Make sure to check out the video on the screen right now, because if you watched this, I bet you will be interested in this one as well. Thank you so much, and stay tuned for part 2 next week.